Okay, we're here in Marion, near Philadelphia, as part of our Parents of the Field project. And this afternoon, which is May the 10th, 2006, we're talking to our Canadian friend and colleague, Dr. Hanna Newcombe, about some of her experiences of the early days of the peace research, peace studies field. So, thinking back to the early days of the field of peace research or conflict research, whatever we're going to call it, people came into that field from all sorts of different intellectual backgrounds and all sorts of different trainings and experiences. What was yours, and what got you interested in the field in the first place?
You're going to find this hard to believe, but I come from chemistry.
Chemistry.
I have a PhD in chemistry, and so did my husband, Alan Newcombe. And we simply switched at one point after we got our PhDs in chemistry. And Alan had been working in industry for a while. I was bringing up 3 babies who are now into their 50s. But
does happen.
Anyway, we found simply that peace is more important than chemistry. We met Norman Alcock in Canada, the founder of the Canadian Peace Research Institute. And he had quit physics in order to go into peace research. He was the first in Canada anyway. And we, all 3 of us, simply thought that in the nuclear age, peace was much more important than the physical sciences, and that scientific methods should be applied in order to obtain world peace and abolish war as a human activity. We could no longer afford wars.
So you said in the nuclear age, around about when was this?
Oh yes, it's, after 1945, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think some of us physical scientists felt a little bit guilty, even though we weren't personally involved. But why should physical sciences do such a thing to humanity, We should have simply not done that research, even in the middle of World War II. But we did, and we thought we have to kind of expiate, whatever the word is, the collective guilt of physical scientists by turning our talents to how to preserve peace forever.
So you mentioned Norman Alcock. How did you actually meet him? How did you come into contact with him?
He was raising funds for his new institute. So he was traveling around and addressing meetings. And we met him at a meeting of the United Nations Association in Hamilton. And we were intrigued by this and kept in touch. For a while we were involved in the fundraising campaign for the new institute, and the institute went into operation in 1961. And then I had been involved in, while I was homebound with the kids, doing abstracts for chemistry. There's a journal called Chemical Abstracts, which does the chemical literature. And I figured, well, if there's going to be a new science of peace research, it will need abstracts as well, so that researchers could look at what had been done before and build on the previous research instead of uselessly repeating. So we started the Peace Research Abstracts Journal.
I remember we used to get those in London.
It's being published now by Sage in California. We no longer edited, but until last year I was still the editor.
Ah.
I was only recently retired.
So it's still going.
I couldn't read anymore fast enough to do the abstracts because we had so many thousands. Like I think in the end we had accumulated 250,000 abstracts.
Well,
quarter of a million.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I've found looking at the field currently is that it's grown so enormously that it's very difficult to keep track of what everybody's doing. Did you find that? Did you find it getting increasingly difficult to abstract all of the stuff that's
Well,
covered?
I couldn't even have the ambition to abstract everything, even in the 60s. It wasn't like chemical abstracts where you could claim comprehensiveness, but in peace research you couldn't, because where do you draw the line? Some articles by peace activists are relevant to peace research. Do you abstract them or not? And then there are articles in political science which are on the borderline, or in psychology which are on the borderline. So where do you stop? We never claimed to be comprehensive, but it was difficult to cover the main things.
So going back to that time when you started off doing the abstracts, I remember them very clearly, but I also remember that you used to publish a series of very interesting studies in little booklets. How did that come about?
Peace Research Review.
Peace Research Reviews.
That came a few years later, I think in 1965.
Yes, I think
And
that was the
these
first
were
one.
articles, review articles by various authors. We didn't pay the authors anything. We gave them the copyright to their article, whatever that was worth. And again, we distributed, just like the abstract journal, mainly to university libraries. We just barely made enough to cover publication costs.
Now they were very good. I used to use some of them myself when I was a graduate student in the 60s. I remember one particularly that Alan edited, I think, on Charles Osgood's ideas about grit, if you remember that.
Oh, yes.
Remember that one?
Yes.
No, they were very good.
Well, my husband edited that, but the ideas come from Charles Osgood, of course.
Can you tell us something a bit more about the development of the Canadian Peace Research Institute? How did it get started? What influence people like Norman Alcock had on its development?
Well, Norman Alcock, and then there were two social psychologists who did attitude studies.
Bill Eckhart?
One name was Paul, and the other one was Lawlicht. And they published attitude study of peace attitudes in Canada of the general population and some elites, political leaders and so on. And so that was a commercial book that they produced. And then there was also an institute, a man called Gideon Rosenblut, who was an economist. And he studied what would be the effect of closing down the armaments industry. How would you cure unemployment? How would you convert to peaceful production? And again, this was a Canadian book, so it mainly addressed the Canadian economy.
Round about that time, I remember it was very common to talk about, on the one hand, peace studies and peace research, and on the other hand, conflict research or conflict resolution. And there seemed to be at the time some kind of difference between the two fields. I mean, were you conscious of that at all, or were you worried about it?
some people were avoiding the word peace because in the public mind during the Cold War it was associated with the communists. So they started talking about conflict resolution or just conflict. Now, Norman Alcock and also the Newcombes decided we want to keep the word peace and make it respectable. And the only way to do it is not to drop the word peace, but to use it. So we called it peace research, quite frankly, while the Institute in Michigan called itself conflict resolution.
Right.
So
yes, and
that was the only difference, really, the main difference.
Okay, so it was a difference in labels rather than anything substantive.
Although later on there developed a breed of conflict researchers who were mainly political scientists and so on, and who studied conflict, not necessarily conflict resolution or conflict ending, because it was interesting from the social science point of view, and they were just building their careers and not really caring about producing world peace or even talking to the decision makers. So that was a real split because we were always goal oriented. The metaphor that Alcock used was medical studies are oriented toward health. But medical researchers study diseases in order to prevent them. So same with conflict and peace. In fact, Alcock wrote a book once called The War Disease.
I remember. Yes, I remember that book. So let me go back to where you came from. You and your husband were both chemists. Alcock was a physicist. So you were coming into a field from very different backgrounds. Can you think back and think to the issue of whose ideas influenced you very much at this time? Was there anybody particularly who you thought was a good peace researcher, or were there ideas floating around from Canada or from elsewhere that you thought were important at that time? We mentioned Charles Osgood and Grit, but were there other people who were influential on you who were not at the Institute?
I was always peace-oriented. You might call me a peace movement people. Before the research idea came up. The research idea came up in Canada in the early 60s. But even back during university years in 1948, I joined the World Federalists, trying to unify the world and thereby make war impossible, except for civil war of some kind. And I'm still a member of that. I'm still a member of about a dozen different peace organizations. In fact, I'm going to a conference in Vancouver later on in June, another one in Calgary later on in June. So I still do the peace movement conference circuit.
So you probably know my old friend Nigel Young then, do you?
Yeah.
You know Nigel at Colgate? He was very much a British peace activist.
I come originally not from Canada. I'm not Canada born. My husband is. But I come originally from Czechoslovakia.
Oh.
And me and my parents emigrated to Canada in 1939. Just as World War II was beginning, and Hitler was in power, and we were a Jewish family. So it was a good thing we left.
Yes, indeed.
And so I was interested in peace even back in Prague as a teenager. Yeah. So it wasn't anything new. The research part was new.
Oh, I didn't realise that. I have always thought of you as a Canadian, but I guess...
Well, my husband is a Canadian, born in Canada, in fact born in Hamilton, Ontario, but his parents came from Britain.
Ah, okay.
So we were sort of a cross-religious marriage, because his parents were Anglicans, but not really believing very much. And my parents were Jewish and not believing very much either, so it was an easy crossing.
Yeah, so it's the joining of unbeliefs. Okay, say a little bit more about those early days in Canada and whether it was easy or difficult to make contact with other people who were working in the field in other countries. How did you do that? How did you make contact with other people?
At conferences and via the journal, we asked people to do volunteer abstracting for our journal. And so we met Kenneth Boulding, the economist in Michigan, and J. David Singer, political science in Michigan, Paul Smoker from Britain.
Any particular conferences that were important, do you remember, in those days?
Well, the International Peace Research Association started just about then. Partly, actually, a person associated with our institute, Jerry Hunius, was active, and partly Elise Boulding. And that is still going. And they're the ones that are now going to have the conference, it's a biennial, in Calgary, Alberta. So I'm going to that.
Good. Well, it's great that it's still going, because it's one of the oldest ones, isn't it?
Well, I guess it's pretty old. You know, it was newer than Walter Isaac's, I think, which now is called Peace Science, but originally it was called Peace Research.
Yes, that's right, it was. He changed the name in the 70s, I think, maybe the 80s.
In order he was trying to make a difference between his organization and IPRA.
Yeah, he was very insistent upon using the word science, and a lot of people have said one of the things we were trying to do in the early days was to become a social science. Did any of that sort of brush up on you?
He is still quantitative oriented. He comes from economics, but he applies mathematics to economics. And so he believes that in order to be scientific, you have to be mathematical. Not everybody believes that. That's a real split. Because there are many peace researchers who would emphasize education or psychology or political science. Political science really isn't a science. It should be called political studies.
Well, it is back in Britain still. It's over here. It's a science.
But you know, quantitative methods were applied there by J. David Singer. He is also a believer in the mathematical approach. And Alcock was interested in that.
Was he now?
And
but it never seems to have affected you or the work that you did with your husband. I mean, yours was, very much what we call soft science.
My husband was trying to predict war from national armaments. So that was a quantitative study also. Any nations that were overarmed, there was above a certain norm, were about 15 times more likely to get involved in wars. My research, besides doing the abstracts, was on voting by nations in the UN General Assembly. So that was quantitative too. And I tried to do that until the year 2000. We haven't quite made it. I think we're stuck somewhere in 1998. I don't know if I'll ever finish it now.
Well, you've certainly tried to keep it up to date anyway. So other people at that time, you've mentioned Kenneth and Elise Boulding and David Singer.
Yeah.
Anybody from Europe that you thought
Paul
was...
Smoker was from Britain.
Yeah.
And there was somebody called Boutou in France.
Gaston Boutou, yes.
Yeah.
I think
I've never met him, but I knew him from the literature.
Any Scandinavians around at that time?
Oh yeah, well, Johan Galtung
of course, yeah.
was a big name and still is. He's still very active.
Yeah. So. And you met a lot of these people at the IPRA conferences. Were there other conferences that were important at that time? And did you travel? Did you? I remember meeting Alan in London a couple of times when he was on his way somewhere. Don't think I ever met you. Did the pair of you travel?
I did travel. Usually it was just one of us, and that was because we had to pay our own way.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes there were grants by the Canadian Social Science Council, but they soon cut it off. They still give travel grants, but only to university-affiliated people, and we weren't.
Well, I was going to ask about the Institute. I mean, you were not affiliated to a university at all, ever.
We were always a freestanding university, and in a way that was an advantage because there was a peace studies, I forget what they're called, center, I think, at McMaster University, and they almost got cancelled by the university administration as being just a fringe subject.
Oh, yes.
So nobody can cancel an independent institute. It can go broke, mind you, but it cannot be cancelled by the higher-ups.
Yeah. Were you ever close to going broke?
Yes. We stopped paying salaries at one point because there wasn't enough money. So some of the researchers quit because they couldn't make it, but Alcock and Newcombes stuck with it and became full-time volunteers, just forever.
Yeah. But did the Canadian government ever give you any support at all, as opposed
Originally, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, a name that you probably know.
I remember. I do remember. Trendy Trudy.
Was on the board of directors. But when he became a political leader, he quit because he thought it would be a conflict of interest. But he was still sympathetic, even though he didn't do anything directly after that. And there were a few government grants in the early years. There were a few foundation grants. There was a UNESCO grant. Alan, my husband, was quite good at fundraising. I'm not. When I get one of these application forms, I just throw up my hands and I say, I'm going to write reams of essays about our aims, and then they're going to say, no, I'm not going to do it.
I have a somewhat similar reaction. Yeah. You sometimes feel as though you're spending far more time actually writing grants to let you do research than doing research.
That's right.
Yeah.
So anyway, my husband died of Parkinson's in 1991. And after that, I didn't really do much foundation fundraising, and we just slowly spun out financially. Because the journals weren't making any money, especially the reviews. The reviews were losing money.
Were they?
It cost more to produce them than we had subscriptions. But we continued for a while, and then we had to cancel it. And the abstracts was taken over by this publisher in California, so it's still going on. The Peace Research Reviews is gone.
And the Institute itself formally came to an end?
The Institute itself just closed a couple of months ago. It took about a year to do the closing because there was still a little bit of money left to pay my helper Linda Carroll, who was on salary. I was a volunteer and we had nobody else. So we sort of continued a little bit, and then we transferred leftover money. According to the rules, it had to be to charity organizations that had a charity exemption number. And we gave some to the World Federalist Foundation and to, not Project Plowshares, Science for Peace, and the United Nations Association. So we disposed of leftover funds, and the account is now zero.
Oh, well, at least you have the knowledge that you...
A little louder, please.
Sorry, at least you've got the knowledge that you were one of the pioneers and one of the first things to institutions to start off the field, and it has grown enormously since those days, of course.
It's good to know, to have been in at the beginning, but I wonder sometimes what we achieved. I mean, the world is no more peaceful than it ever was. We still have danger from nuclear weapons, even though the public doesn't seem to realize it anymore. You mention nuclear weapons and people say, oh, but that stopped with stopping of the Cold War. Like heck it did. Both the US and Russia are still on instant alert. Launch on warning, which could spark accidental nuclear war even now, anytime. That's my main problem now, trying to persuade people to drop that, because it could be done without abolishing deterrence and without verification. The leaders could do it. But they're not getting around to it. It's not one of their priorities, I guess. Maybe they'll get around to it, I don't know. But I keep on talking about that. It would make us all much safer.
Well, maybe this latest concern about Iran, which you probably remember years ago, people used to talk about the end of country problem. What's going to happen when a lot of people get nuclear weapons? Perhaps that will start off people thinking again, we must do something about the nuclear problem.
Well, okay, but you see, as I said, abolishing the instant launch on warning wouldn't abolish deterrence. That would still continue to exist. So if we need any security assurance, that would remain. So it's not related to the Iran problem, but people don't understand that. It's a little technical, and it needs explaining. And my friend Alan Phillips has explained it in several excellent papers that I keep on distributing. I haven't got a copy with me, but it's my main concern right now to at least prevent accidental nuclear war.
All right, so thinking again back to the 1960s and people that you came in contact with, you talked about Johan Galtung and about the Scandinavians, but other Canadians, there were not just Norman and your husband, but there was beginning to be some interest in peacekeeping in Canada particularly. What other contacts did you make in your own country, in Canada, which pushed the field forward, or did you feel somewhat isolated from other researchers? How did you build bridges?
Well, we had an association, a professional association, called Canadian Peace Research and Education Association. It still exists, and it's also going to meet in Calgary. That would have a conference every year, giving papers of various researchers not affiliated to our institute, but doing peace-related work. So I met a lot of those people. I don't know if I remember names now.
But that's an interesting association,
yeah. It's a small association, and it's also harder for money. So I'm always associated with poor organizations. How come?
Well, I think one answer is look at the budget of defense departments and compare it with the budget for peace research or anything like that.
Yes, if I was working for the Department of Defense, I might be rich, but I might also feel guilty. It's not worth it.
The field peace research started off with some very high aspirations, things that it was very definitely trying to do. And you talked a little bit about the disappointment over the nuclear issue. Can you reflect on whether you think that we've fulfilled some of those aspirations, some of those early hopes, or not? Where have we gone wrong? Where have we fallen short?
One of the happy stories my husband was fond of telling, and it was exactly the Peace Research Review on grit.
Oh, okay.
And we had a friend in political science called Edward Azar.
Oh, Ed, yes, of course.
He was from Lebanon,
He was Lebanese.
And so one time he traveled to Egypt, somewhere in the 70s, I think, and he found that the Prime Minister of Egypt, Sadat, was reading that Peace Research Review.
Really?
And shortly after that, Sadat traveled to Jerusalem and made peace between Egypt and Israel. And that was a great initiative, a classical one. So, was it caused by the literature or not? You know, he never said. So nobody will ever know, but we can chalk that one up for credit, I think. And there might have been some other incidents like that. So, you know, the peace in the Middle East didn't last very long, mind you, but relations between Egypt and Israel are still okay.
So that was one thing. That was a plus. Can you think of any other pluses that, looking back, you think we've done well at? We might get an A- at least.
Well, I think some of the game theory, you know, Prisoner's Dilemma, has now become commonplace in psychology, and that was introduced by Anatole Rappaport, who was one of the early peace researchers, and he made that prisoner dilemma theory of conflict applicable in all sorts of conflict situations, and other game theory as well. So he pioneered that into psychology,
Yeah.
not into the leadership of nations, but I think they too might already know that term by now.
Mm-hmm.
It does spread. And arms race theory, the early Richardson
Yeah.
mathematical theory of how nations escalate when they're initially unfriendly.
Mm.
One arms and the other one has to make it better, and so it escalates
Yeah.
up. And that grit is actually a de-escalation of the arms race.
Mm.
You make a unilateral initiative downward and you challenge your opponent to reciprocate.
So, what you seem to be saying is something a number of other people that we've interviewed have said, that the field, whatever we're going to call it, borrows from other disciplines and uses ideas from psychology or from mathematics
Yeah.
in terms of prisoner's dilemma. What other disciplines do you think we've borrowed from?
Well, mathematics, as I mentioned earlier, the Richardson arms race theory is mathematical, game theory is mathematical, and Walter Izard's economics is mathematical. So mathematics is just a tool, of course, it doesn't have results of its own, but it's a tool often used by peace researchers.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of
Peace
course.
research is sort of a cross-discipline of political science and psychology and mathematics somehow coming in, and economics. I don't really know enough about sociology to see where it comes in, but it obviously does.
Yeah, well, there were several sociologists in the early days of conflict, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, that were making contributions, of course, in that thing. I can't remember whether you or your husband ever published in that journal. I think you did, didn't you?
Journal of Conflict
Journal of
Resolution.
Conflict Resolution. I think you had something in there a while ago.
I think we may have had what we used to call the fuse, neighboring nations that were mutually hostile and overarmed, and therefore were kind of a fuse to conflict.
Okay.
Now, I don't know if that was the Journal of Peace Research or Journal of Peace of Conflict Resolution. I don't remember for sure, but we had it in one of those journals. And there was a regular chain like that. It may still exist. I think it's been somewhat disrupted, but
Yeah. Do you think, looking back, that the field was particularly influenced at different times by different disciplines? I had the impression, for example, that psychology was very important in the early days, and mathematics as well. Anatole, of course, was also a mathematician, wasn't he? And then the political scientists seemed to take over. But what was your impression of where we got most of our ideas from in those early days?
well, psychology and political science. Like, Singer was a political scientist.
Of course, yes.
Balding was an economist. I don't know if it's changed over the years. It has changed at one point with so-called radical peace research.
Oh, yes.
People who wanted to apply Marxist theories. Now, they were very unpopular with my husband and me, especially my husband. And in fact, it was kind of impressionistic, and it sneered at mathematics. But there was a school of thought there, and Galton was part of it at one point. I don't think he is anymore. And then there was a change again with the end of the Cold War from kind of focusing on developing countries and trying to get equality economically as a basis of peace, but coming back to the armaments questions. And I think that's where we are now. So there are cyclic changes, but I'm not sure where we are now.
Where do you think we're going?
In the future?
Where would you like to see us go?
I think there should be far more emphasis to contact with leaders, with decision makers, trying to influence them toward the idea of peace and disarmament, which I don't know that they're ready to listen to. Some are. The Scandinavians are, sometimes the Canadians, but not lately. And the U.S. is a bad case, I'm sorry to say.
Well, I don't think I disagree with you, so in what sense is it a bad case?
Well,
what would you like it to see it doing that it's not doing?
In the sense that the president is still talking about new kinds of nuclear weapons, about doing preventive nuclear war on proliferators. Where are we? You know, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty puts an onus on the nuclear weapon states, as well as the non-nuclears, to seriously negotiate their own disarmament. Now, is the U.S. doing it, or is it going the wrong way? I know, it seems to me recently Congress canceled some the bunker buster law, which is a move in the right direction. I don't know what Bush is going to do about that. Presently it's not funded. So I don't know. Things are good, bad, and mixed. I'm not sure where we're going in the future, you know. As somebody once said, prognostication is difficult, especially about the future.
Well, it's easier about the past. All right, let me sort of push you a bit more. If you were able to do something about what we studied in the future, what we found out about, what would you, if you were starting out all over again, what would you focus on? What do you think the field should focus on?
I'd want to go strongly into nuclear abolition, and secondly about the United Nations reform, especially Security Council reform, to have the 5 permanent members of the Security Council the same as the nuclear weapon states is like, you know, putting the fox in charge of the hen house.
Yeah. You, I think, appreciate this more than some of the other people that we've interviewed. There's always been a tendency in the field, in peace research and conflict research, for the field to be both theoretical, yes.
That what?
To be theoretical and to be scientific, but also to be practical and applied. I mean, and you mentioned Anwar Sadat reading grit. You know, do you think that we've actually succeeded in that, in mixing practice and
No.
No?
The peace movement is still skeptical about research, especially the quantitative kind. The quantitative peace research looks down on the peace movement. There is a kind of a split there, but there are a few people like me who try to bridge the chasm, or however you say that.
So do you think you've succeeded on occasions?
sometimes.
Such as?
Yeah, there are a few people who cut across and see the validity of both approaches and might even take part in both of them.
Yeah.
So, but not all of them. The academically minded conflict researchers just seem to be after professional advancement of themselves. It's a kind of a profit motive.
Apart from the gap between sort of the peace movements and peace researchers, do you think that the field as a whole has made much of an impact on policymakers, on decision makers, and if it hasn't, why do you think?
In some countries, maybe, even a few European countries like Germany under a social democratic government, but not really the top superpowers. I don't know what would have happened if peace research hadn't existed. Maybe it would be worse. You never know the alternative future, as I call it.
Yeah.
But I don't think the impact has been sufficient. It's not yet enough. We're still in crucial danger as a world.
What would you recommend we do about this?
Well, I'd like to persuade some more of the peace researchers, who published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution and so on, and analyze conflicts, to talk to decision makers, to talk to Congress people, and make them aware of the kind of results we have. We have a really solid result in peace research in that democratic countries, especially the long-established democracies, don't fight each other. They may fight non-democracies, in fact they do quite often, but not each other. So if the number of democratic countries in the world were increased, then maybe at least international wars would decrease, and possibly civil wars as well, because civil wars are scarce in highly developed democracies as well.
So that's one thing, one idea we could present.
And that idea is being pushed by U.S. foreign policy. But, to sort of impose democracy from above may not be as good as democracy arising from below, from the people. And I don't know if we know how to do that.
Perhaps slowly, gradually, and carefully is the answer. What other presents do you think we could make to decision makers? I mean, the sort of democratic states theory is one thing we can give to them. What else do you think we've produced that we could say to decision makers, here, take notice of this?
Well, the relatively successful use in various places of non-violent methods. It has worked in internal wars, in deposing tyrants in several places. You have to have a large population behind your movement to just get 100 people to march down the street isn't going to do it. But it is a viable alternative to violence, and I think people should realize that. people think of violence as being the last alternative. If everything else fails, well, we have to reach for military might. We actually don't. There's another possibility of applying principled Gandhian type nonviolence on a large scale. It has worked before in several cases. It has also failed. But armed resistance has also failed in some cases. So it's not a foolproof method for victory. And the other thing is fostering world-mindedness. I'm still, I joined World Federalists way back, and I think of humankind as being what I belong to. I'm not primarily a Canadian citizen or Czech Republic citizen or a Jewish religionist or the mother of 2 U.S. citizens. I try to be for everybody. And you still see that tendency in, let's say, the Iraq War or Afghanistan, of emphasizing our casualties, how many were there, and not counting the Iraqi and Afghan casualties, which are much bigger. These are also human beings. And we're all, I can go back to biology now, we're all at least each other's 50th cousin. We're not exactly brothers, but we're all cousins of some degree or other. And we share 99.99% of our DNA. Not 100%, but sizable.
Close enough.
So, why not have compassion for all human beings, whether we ever met them or not? There was one poet in the Soviet Union, a woman, who wrote, "I have compassion for all my friends whom I have never met." And this is the kind of feeling to try to cultivate among people. But how many people are still strongly nationalistic or strongly Christian or strongly Muslim, strongly Buddhist, strongly one thing that differentiates you from other people? I think the majority is still like that, unfortunately, and I don't know what kind of a percentage of the total population we have to get to finally click in and realize that we all belong together.